The Three Musketeers. Chapter 1. Leaving Home. D'Artagnan did not come from a rich family. When it was his time to leave home and find his fortune in the world, his father only had a few things to give him. The first thing his father gave him was a strange yellow horse. That horse would cause D'Artagnan a lot of trouble in the future. The second thing his father gave him was a letter to Mr. Treville, his old friend. This letter would help D'Artagnan find work in Paris. Finally, the old man gave his son 15 gold pieces and this advice.
"My son,"
he began,
"you must now leave your family and go out into the world to find fortune and fame. In the world today, men become rich by using bravery and their skill with a sword. Take this letter to my old friend, Mr. Treville. He will help you. Listen to Mr. Treville's words and do what he says. Mr. Treville is a great example to follow. When he was your age, he left home for Paris to make his fortune. Now, he is a powerful and famous man. He is the captain of the Musketeers who guard our great king. Take this letter to him and ask him for work. Work hard and work with honor, my son."
D'Artagnan took the letter and the gold pieces and went to see his mother. His mother loved her only son and would miss him greatly. But she did not show her tears. She told him to stay safe and gave him a bottle of medicine, which could heal all but death wounds. D'Artagnan kissed her goodbye and jumped on his yellow horse. On the first Monday of April, 1626, D'Artagnan arrived at the city of Meung. The people in the town watched him ride by on his strange horse. A few young women waved at him from their high windows. D'Artagnan was a tall and strong young man. His face was thin and brave, and his eyes were dark and deep. Though he was only 19, he was already quite handsome. D'Artagnan was from the town of Gascony. The men of Gascony are famous for being brave when faced with danger, and sometimes for having violent moods. He stared into the eyes of the people on the street fiercely. Eventually, he arrived at an inn and jumped down from his horse. He heard a loud sound of laughter. D'Artagnan turned quickly around on his feet and stared where he had heard the sound. There was a window open on the first floor. A man was sitting by the window. He looked about 30 years old. His eyes were sharp and black, and his skin was dark. D'Artagnan saw that the man had a large scar cut into his face above his black beard. There were 2 men sitting next to him. They were both quite large, and they were listening to the scarred man's words with great concentration. The stranger was staring at D'Artagnan's yellow horse. He then pointed at the horse, smiled, and said something that made his friends again laugh loudly. D'Artagnan was quickly filled with anger. He reached down and grasped the handle of his sword and moved towards the window. He pointed at the stranger.
"You, sir,"
he loudly said,
"tell me what you men are laughing at, and we can laugh together." "I was not speaking to you, sir,"
the man coldly replied.
"But I was speaking to you,"
cried D'Artagnan. The stranger looked at him with small eyes. He then stood up and came out of the inn.
"Your horse,"
he said,
"must have been born a flower. Yellow flowers are quite common. but yellow certainly is a strange color for a horse."
The man turned around again and moved a step back towards the inn. D'Artagnan pulled his sword out and yelled,
"Turn around, funny sir, or will I have to strike you from behind?"
The stranger turned around quickly and stared at the young man, feeling both surprised and angry. He exclaimed,
"Strike me? You must be crazy."
D'Artagnan became angrier at the man's words and jumped violently at the stranger with his sword. The stranger was fast with his sword and pulled it out before D'Artagnan could hit him. The stranger's friends rushed out of the inn, carrying bats and sticks. They jumped on D'Artagnan and attacked him from all sides at the same time. One of the stranger's servants hit D'Artagnan's sword and broke it into 2 pieces. Then a second man hit D'Artagnan on his head, and he fell to the ground, unconscious. The inn owner looked down at D'Artagnan's body and asked the stranger what to do with him.
"Take him inside and cure his wounds,"
the stranger said coldly.
"When he wakes up, put him on his yellow horse and tell him to go back to where he came from."
The inn owner raised his hand up, and 2 of his servants came over and carried D'Artagnan inside. The stranger went back inside and sat back down with his friends. A bit later, the inn owner returned and asked the stranger if he had been hurt. The stranger smiled.
"Not at all,"
he said.
"Is the crazy young man awake yet?" "He awoke for just a moment before,"
replied the inn owner.
"He said, 'I will tell Mr. Treville of this insult to his old friend's son.' Then the young man fell unconscious again." "Treville?"
the stranger said quietly.
"I searched his pockets,"
said the inn owner.
"There was a letter in one of them to Mr. Treville in Paris." "Did you take the letter out of his coat?" "No, I put it back into his pocket. Not my affair, really. His coat is in the kitchen. If this crazy young man annoys you, I can—" "He annoys me greatly. Now, prepare my horse at once."
The inn owner quickly left the room. The stranger said quietly to himself,
"I am curious to know what is written in this letter to Treville."
He stood up and walked quietly into the kitchen. D'Artagnan's coat was lying on a chair. The stranger grasped the letter and again stepped quickly out of the room. Chapter 2. The Missing Letter. D'Artagnan did not awake until evening. He saw the inn owner sitting above him when he opened his eyes. The inn owner coldly and angrily said,
"Young man, you have caused me a lot of trouble. Though you are weak, you should leave here immediately. Come on, get up."
His head still hurting and not yet awake, D'Artagnan stood up and walked down the inn stairs. He forgot to get his coat or even put on his boots. He looked out of the window on the first floor and saw the stranger standing beside a carriage and talking to a woman inside. He called the woman My Lady. D'Artagnan could see that My Lady was quite young and very beautiful. "What are the cardinal's orders?" she asked the stranger.
"You must go at once to England,"
the stranger replied,
"and send a letter to the cardinal as soon as the Duke leaves London."
"Is there anything else?" asked My Lady.
"The rest of your instructions are in this box. Do not open it until you arrive safely in England. I shall now return to Paris."
"What? What about punishing that rude boy from Gascony?" The stranger was about to answer when D'Artagnan rushed out of the inn, yelling fiercely,
"This rude boy from Gascony will punish you first, as you will soon see."
The stranger turned around quickly, and his hand flew to the handle of his sword. Before he pulled it out, my lady called out, "Don't waste time fighting! Remember that we must move quickly to succeed."
"You are right, as always, milady,"
he said.
"Let's go."
He jumped up onto his horse, while my lady told her carriage driver to ready the horses. The inn owner ran outside and yelled,
"Wait a moment. You still haven't paid for your room and food." "Pay him,"
the stranger ordered his servant. The servant rudely threw 3 pieces of silver on the ground at the inn owner's feet, jumped on his own horse, and rode off with his master.
"You are a coward,"
yelled D'Artagnan, running after the stranger, but his head became dizzy and he fell down to his knees.
"Yes, he is a true coward,"
said the inn owner angrily, as he picked the silver coins off the ground. D'Artagnan then said quietly,
"Though he was truly a coward, the lady was truly beautiful." "Who?"
asked the landlord.
"Milady, the woman in the carriage,"
D'Artagnan said weakly, and again fell unconscious on the ground.
"Well,"
said the landlord,
2 customers have left me, but it looks like one will stay, and I believe he will be here for at least a few more days."
The inn owner did not know the strength of D'Artagnan. The next morning, D'Artagnan got up at dawn. He came down into the kitchen and got his mother's medicine from his coat. He put it on his wound, and it cured instantly. That same night, D'Artagnan was already walking around the town, and the next morning he was already strong enough to continue riding to Paris. When D'Artagnan went to pay his bill, he noticed that his gold was still in his pocket, but his father's letter was missing. D'Artagnan screamed out loudly and promised to heaven that he would destroy the whole inn if his letter were not found. He reached for his sword, but forgot that the stranger's servant had already broken it.
"Where is my letter?"
he screamed, like a lion ready to attack.
"It is for Mr. Treville, and if it is lost, he will want to know why." "Is there anything of high value in it?"
the inn owner asked.
"Anything of high value? My whole fortune is in that letter,"
shouted D'Artagnan angrily.
"Wait,"
cried the inn owner.
"I think I know. Your letter was not lost, it was stolen. I saw the man with the scar on his face go into the kitchen where your coat was. He could have stolen it." "Do you think he did?"
asked D'Artagnan.
"I'm almost sure,"
continued the inn owner.
"I had seen the letter in your pocket when I was curing you. When I told the man that you were a friend of Mr. Treville, he looked very worried. Right after I told him, I saw him go into the kitchen. Then he must be the thief,"
said D'Artagnan.
"I will go to tell Mr. Treville of this affair. Even the king himself shall hear of it."
After saying this, D'Artagnan jumped on his horse and rode off towards Paris. When he arrived in the city, he sold his strange horse to a merchant. He then began walking towards the palace on foot, carrying his bags with him. That night he slept in an inn in the center of the city, near the king's palace. The next morning he went out and bought a new set of clothes and a new sword. He then bathed and fixed his hair. When he was finally happy with his appearance, he set out to see Mr. Treville, the 3rd most powerful person in France. Chapter 3. Meeting Mr. Treville. Mr. Treville, like young D'Artagnan, had left home when quite young to find his fortune in the world. He had come to Paris without money or connections. The only thing he brought with him was his bravery, great skill with a sword, and a quick mind. After many years, his fame grew, and, eventually, he became one of the king's most trusted servants. Louis XIII trusted Mr. Treville perhaps even more than he trusted the Prime Minister or even his own wife. He made Treville the captain of his guards, the Musketeers. Mr. Treville was the third most powerful man in France at this time. Cardinal Richelieu was the second. He was Prime Minister of France. Cardinal Richelieu had great influence with the king, who listened to his advice closely. Both the king and the cardinal had a group of armed bodyguards. The two men were both very competitive, and they each tried to find the best swordsman. The king's guards were called the Musketeers. They were all brave men who did not fear death. Richelieu's men were called simply the Cardinal's Guards. The Cardinal needed loyal guards because he had many powerful enemies. One of his enemies was the Queen, Anne of Austria. She feared the Cardinal's power and his influence over her husband, the King. The second was Mr. Treville. He would often have his musketeers train in front of the Cardinal's house to show off their strength. This always made the Cardinal red with anger. D'Artagnan found his way to the Musketeers' camp early that day. The camp was full of men, all wearing the traditional uniform of the Musketeers. They all carried swords and were standing in groups talking and laughing. D'Artagnan moved through the crowd in the courtyard and entered the large building at the end. He went through a large door and found himself in a large hall filled with swordsmen. He walked down the hall, feeling very excited and a little nervous. At the end of the hall was a stair, and D'Artagnan hurried up them. He asked the way to Mr. Treville's room and was brought into a waiting room. An older musketeer came over and asked him what he wanted. D'Artagnan told him, and the musketeer nodded his head. While he was waiting, D'Artagnan looked around the room and listened to a group of musketeers talking. He was shocked to hear that they were all telling jokes about Cardinal Richelieu. D'Artagnan's father had said that the Cardinal was a great man and had taught his son to have respect for him. Strangely, the musketeers spoke loudly about his bent legs and funny face and made plans to annoy his guards. D'Artagnan's eyes then spotted a very tall musketeer. He was as big as a mountain, with a proud face and huge, strong hands. He was wearing a beautiful sword belt made of gold and a long purple cloak.
"Where did you get your wonderful belt, Porthos?"
A musketeer asked.
"I had it made especially for me,"
replied Porthos, touching his thick mustache.
"I paid a lot of money for it, didn't I, Aramis?"
The musketeer whom he called Aramis was a young man. His skin was darker than most people, and he had black eyes, a little beard, and a small mustache. He did not seem to speak much and laughed quietly. To answer his friend's question, he only nodded his head. A servant then came out of Mr. Treville's room.
"Mr. Treville will now see Mr. d'Artagnan,"
he cried. Everyone in the room became silent as D'Artagnan walked across the room. All the musketeers watched him. Mr. Treville, the captain of the musketeers, was standing by an open window. He was very tall and strong and had thick gray hair. He turned around and looked at D'Artagnan.
"Please, wait a moment,"
Treville said, and walked over to the door.
"Athos?"
he shouted loudly.
Porthos! Aramis, come in here.
The two musketeers whom D'Artagnan had seen in the waiting room came in. Mr. Treville walked around the room for a minute and then stopped suddenly in front of them and stared at each of them with eyes as sharp as swords.
Yesterday evening I had dinner with the king. Do you know what he said to me?
He shouted angrily.
No, sir,
answered Porthos.
We do not know. He said that in the future he planned to choose his guards from among the cardinal's men. Use the cardinal's men?
Cried Porthos angrily.
Why? Because his musketeers are weak cowards, it seems,
said Treville seriously. Both musketeers' faces turned red.
The king was right,
yelled Treville, staring at them.
Last night some of the musketeers made trouble in an inn, and the cardinal's guards had to arrest them. Arrest musketeers. They are supposed to make peace in the city, not trouble. You were there. You, Aramis. Why do you wear a musketeer uniform when you would look better wearing dirty rags? And Porthos, why do you need such a wonderful gold belt to carry such a useless sword? And Athos, where is Athos? Sir,
answered Aramis sadly.
He is very sick. Sick? What's wrong with him? He may have smallpox, sir,
said Porthos sadly.
Smallpox? Not possible. Perhaps he was wounded or killed last night in the inn. But he certainly does not have smallpox. My God! My musketeers will not fight in the streets and will not be laughed at by the cardinal and his guards. Would the cardinal's guards allow themselves to be arrested? They would die before they were arrested. But you ran away from them. Now the whole city is saying that the king's musketeers are cowards. Captain,
cried Porthos,
the truth is that it was not a fair fight. There were 6 musketeers and 6 of the cardinal's guards, but they attacked us by surprise. They killed 2 musketeers and wounded Athos before we even pulled out our swords. Athos tried to stand up, but could not, so the guards left him there, thinking that he would die. They captured us, but we escaped once we got outside. I did not know that they had surprised you like that,
said Treville, with some kindness in his voice.
Sir, please, do not tell the king that Athos is hurt.
Aramis said quickly.
Athos is too embarrassed and does not want his majesty to hear of it.
There was then a knock on the door. The door opened and a tall musketeer entered the room. He had a strong and proud face, but it was also very pale and showing great pain.
Athos!
cried Treville.
You have asked for me, sir?
Athos said weakly. Treville jumped quickly towards him.
Yes, I wanted to say that I don't want my musketeers risking their lives without a good reason,
he said.
You are a brave man, Athos, and you are important to the king, who knows that his musketeers are the bravest men in France. Give me your hand, Athos.
Mr. Treville held the musketeer's hand tightly. Athos became even whiter and fell to the floor unconscious.
Get a doctor, quickly,
cried Treville. The doctor said that Athos definitely would not die, but that he had lost a lot of blood and would be weak for many days. Some other musketeers came in the room and took Athos out. His friends followed him. Finally, D'Artagnan was alone with Mr. Treville.
What do you want?
asked Treville sharply. D'Artagnan repeated his name, and Mr. Treville remembered him at once.
I am sorry,
he said.
I had forgotten you. Your father and I were good friends. How can I help you? I came to ask,
D'Artagnan said carefully,
if you would allow me the honor of wearing the uniform of a musketeer. In the short time I have been here in Paris, I have already seen what a great honor that is. You are right,
agreed Treville.
It is a very great honor. No one can become a musketeer until he has shown that he has uncommon courage,
he said.
Since your father was my good friend,
continued Treville,
I will do what I can to help you. I will write a letter to the director of the Royal Academy. Tomorrow, you can begin studying how to use a sword and ride a horse. I will make sure that you can study without any expense to yourself. Come to see me every few months and tell me about your progress.
D'Artagnan was feeling very disappointed. He felt that Treville was acting a little cold. Without thinking, he quickly cried out,
I can ride and fight already. If only you could see the letter that my father wrote you. I had one, sir, but it was stolen from me.
D'Artagnan then told Mr. Treville about the stranger at the inn in Meung. Mr. Treville looked very interested and said,
You said that the man who stole your letter had a large scar on his face, yes? Yes, sir, on his left cheek,
said D'Artagnan excitedly.
This is very strange,
said Treville seriously.
Do you know this man?
Asked D'Artagnan.
Tell me where I can find him.
Treville looked serious and troubled.
Listen to my advice, young man,
he said with a very serious face.
Do not look for that man. He is quite dangerous.
He then turned away from D'Artagnan and sat down at his desk.
I will write that letter for you.
As he waited for Treville to finish writing, D'Artagnan stood by the window and looked out into the streets of Paris. Treville finished writing the letter and was about to give it to D'Artagnan, when suddenly the young man was seen running towards the door, yelling loudly.
He will not escape this time. Who won't escape?
Asked Treville, standing up shocked.
The man who stole my letter, replied
D'Artagnan while running down the stairs.
I just saw him in the street.
Before Mr. Treville could stop him, D'Artagnan was down the stairs. Chapter 4. 3 Duels. As D'Artagnan ran down the stairs, he ran into a large musketeer who was just coming out of another room. The man yelled out in pain and stared down at D'Artagnan.
Excuse me,
D'Artagnan said without stopping.
It is important that I move quickly.
Before D'Artagnan could walk 3 steps, a strong hand grasped his belt and pulled him back. D'Artagnan turned around quickly and saw that the injured musketeer Athos was holding him. The man was as white as snow.
Sir,
said Athos, taking his hand off D'Artagnan's belt.
You are not polite. I can see that you are not from the city.
D'Artagnan had already begun to turn around and run. But when Athos said these words, he stopped and walked back up to him.
Though I am from the country,
he replied,
I don't think that a man like you can give me lessons in good manners. If I were not running to catch someone, I would— Mr. Man Without Manners,
Athos interrupted calmly.
You can find me without running after me. Where, may I ask? I will be behind the Carmelite church at noon, just me and my sword. I will be there also,
said D'Artagnan.
Try not to be late. That would be polite,
said Athos calmly.
I promise you that a few minutes after noon I shall cut your ears off as you run. We will see who runs,
D'Artagnan replied, and he turned and began running down the stairs again. He ran as fast as he could across the courtyard towards the door. Porthos was talking with another musketeer in front of the door. Between the 2 musketeers, There was just enough room for d'Artagnan to pass through. But as d'Artagnan jumped between them, the wind blew Porthos' long cloak open. D'Artagnan ran straight into the cloak and fell down to the ground, pulling Porthos with him. As the two men stood up, d'Artagnan saw that Porthos' fancy sword belt was fake. The front side was covered with gold, but the back was nothing but common iron. Porthos stood up and fixed his cloak and belt, and then turned to d'Artagnan and said,
"You must be crazy to run into people like this."
D'Artagnan's head bowed a little, and he said, out of breath,
"Excuse me, I am in a great hurry. I need to catch someone who—" "Do you always close your eyes when you are running?"
interrupted Porthos angrily.
"Of course not,"
replied d'Artagnan, annoyed.
"In fact, my eyes let me see what most other people cannot."
Porthos became even angrier and walked a step toward d'Artagnan.
"I'll see you later,"
said the young d'Artagnan as he began to run again.
"And I'll cut off your cloak and belt with my sword. At 1 o'clock behind the Carmelite church."
Porthos yelled after him.
"Very well, 1 o'clock,"
replied d'Artagnan, and ran out into the street. The street was empty, because of running into Athos and Porthos. D'Artagnan had missed his chance to catch the stranger. He began walking down the street looking for him, but he was gone. D'Artagnan recognized Aramis standing farther down the street, chatting with a group of friends. He decided to go over and talk with him. Aramis saw d'Artagnan approaching, but he remembered that this young man had seen Mr. Treville be angry at him, so he pretended that he did not see him. D'Artagnan walked up smiling and bowed deeply. Aramis nodded his head a little, but did not smile. His group of friends all immediately stopped talking. D'Artagnan realized quickly that they did not want to talk with him. He tried to think of the least embarrassing way of leaving the situation. He then looked down and saw that Aramis had dropped his handkerchief and was standing on it. D'Artagnan reached down and pulled the handkerchief from under Aramis' shoe.
"I believe, sir, that you dropped your handkerchief,"
D'Artagnan said politely. D'Artagnan saw that the handkerchief was small and yellow. It did not look like a man's handkerchief. Aramis' face turned red, and he pulled the handkerchief out of D'Artagnan's hand, but not before his group of friends saw the writing on it.
"Aha!"
cried one of his friends.
"You and Madame de Chevreuse must be good friends, if she lends you her handkerchief."
Aramis stared at D'Artagnan angrily, and then said lightly,
"This handkerchief is not mine, sir. You see, mine is here in my pocket."
D'Artagnan realized that he had made a terrible mistake. He walked away and waited for Aramis' friends to leave. Then he came back towards Aramis and said,
"Sir, please excuse me. I did not know—" "Young man,"
Aramis replied seriously.
"you have not acted like a gentleman." "What?"
cried D'Artagnan.
"I was trying to help. I believe that you are not a fool, and that you understand that people stand on handkerchiefs for a reason. Why did you hand it to me publicly, so that a fine lady's name was shown to everyone around? It seems like I need to teach you how to act."
D'Artagnan's right hand grasped the handle of his sword.
"Not here in public, you fool,"
said Aramis in a voice like a snake's.
"I shall wait for you behind the Carmelite church. At 2 o'clock.
replied D'Artagnan sharply.
"I suggest that you bring that handkerchief. Whether it belongs to you or a lady, you will need it to stop your blood from flowing."
The two men bowed to each other and walked away. D'Artagnan, knowing that noon was close, began walking to the church. At this time, it was the custom in France that men fighting a duel would each bring 2 friends, called seconds, with them to the meeting place. They did this so that, if they died, their friends could carry their body home. Since D'Artagnan had just arrived in Paris, he had no friends there. He went to the duel alone. Athos was already at the church and waited in the middle of a grassy field for D'Artagnan. The church sat at one end of the field, and there was forest around the rest.
"My seconds have not come yet,"
said Athos.
"but they should arrive soon. I do not have seconds, sir, for I do not yet have any friends in Paris,"
D'Artagnan explained. Athos looked carefully at the young man.
"I feel sorry that I must kill a man as young as you,"
he said.
"Do not worry about that,"
answered D'Artagnan,
"since you honor me by fighting while you are injured badly. The wound is painful."
Athos agreed.
"But I must tell you that I fight as well with my left hand as my right. Ah, I see my friends coming."
D'Artagnan turned around and saw Aramis and Porthos coming.
"These are your seconds?"
he said, shocked.
"Of course they are,"
replied Athos. His face was surprised.
"We are always together. Don't you know that the people of Paris call us the Three Musketeer brothers?"
By this time, Porthos and Aramis had come close enough to see D'Artagnan. They stood there looking quite shocked.
"What does this mean? Who is this man to you?"
asked Porthos.
"This is the man I am going to fight,"
answered Athos.
"What?"
Porthos cried, amazed.
"He is the man I am fighting as well." "Yes,"
said D'Artagnan.
"but not until 1 o'clock. This is not possible,"
said Aramis.
"He is the man who I plan to duel. Our duel is not until 2 o'clock.
D'Artagnan said calmly.
"Mr. Athos has the first duel and the right to kill me first. He may even do so now. Now, Mr. Athos, prepare your sword."
The 2 men bowed deeply to each other and pulled out their swords. But just as they touched their swords together, they heard the sound of horses quickly running. Suddenly, 5 horsemen came out of the forest along the field's east side and rode straight toward the Musketeers.
"It's the Cardinal's guards,"
Aramis cried.
"Put down your swords quickly."
But it was already too late. The horsemen had already seen Athos and D'Artagnan fighting. Even now, the sunlight was shining off their swords brightly. The horsemen stopped about 30 steps from them.
"My God, it's Captain Jussac himself,"
said Porthos. The captain rode forward. He was tall and wore dark clothes. D'Artagnan stared at him with great interest. Jussac looked angry as he came closer, but he had a strange smile on his face.
"Fighting again, are you?"
he said loudly.
"You all know that dueling is not allowed by law. It is my job to stop you. Put down your swords and follow me."
Aramis smiled.
"Sir,"
he said, copying Jussac's loud and serious voice,
"we cannot put down our swords or follow you. You know that Mr. Treville wouldn't like us to be arrested. Please, leave now and let us handle our own affairs. If you disobey, we will have to use our swords to stop you,"
said Jussac.
"There are 5 of them and 3 of us,"
whispered Athos.
"I think we can win."
Athos, Porthos, and Aramis quickly moved close together. Jussac raised his hand to prepare his men for battle. D'Artagnan then stepped towards the Musketeers.
"Gentlemen,"
he said with a smile,
"we are not 3, but 4. You are not one of us."
said Porthos.
"I may not have the uniform of a musketeer,"
replied d'Artagnan,
"but I have the heart and spirit of one. You are a brave man,"
Athos said as he grasped d'Artagnan's hand.
"What is your name, sir?" "It's D'Artagnan, sir." "Well, then, Athos, Porthos, Aramis, and D'Artagnan. Attack!"
cried Athos. Immediately they each pulled out their swords. The 4 swords shined bright in the sunlight. Jussac and his men jumped down from their horses and drew their swords. For a moment they stood staring at d'Artagnan and the Musketeers. Then they ran at them with loud, violent yells. 2 men attacked Aramis at once, while d'Artagnan jumped forward to fight Jussac. D'Artagnan fought like a tiger, jumping at the older man on all sides and making quick stabs with his sword. Jussac was a very experienced swordsman, but he quickly found that it took all his skill to defend himself against d'Artagnan's attack. He was used to men who fought with traditional sword styles, but d'Artagnan's method seemed to disobey all of the rules. As Jussac became tired, he made one great jump and aimed a terrible stab at d'Artagnan's heart. D'Artagnan blocked his attack and, while Jussac was recovering, pulled a knife out from his belt and pushed it through his enemy's body. He fell to the ground heavily, with a loud yell of pain. D'Artagnan quickly turned around and looked around the field with worry. He saw that Aramis had killed one of the 2 guards who attacked him and was still fighting with the second. Porthos had stabbed his enemy in the leg and, in return, had been stabbed in his arm. Neither wound was serious, and the 2 fought even harder. The wounded Athos was fighting bravely, but his face was very pale and he was weak. D'Artagnan jumped to help him, yelling to the cardinal's guard,
"Face towards me, Sir Guard, or I will have to kill you."
The guard quickly turned around to fight d'Artagnan, and at that very moment Athos fell down onto one knee.
"Do not kill that man, D'Artagnan,"
Athos asked.
"He is the one who wounded me before, and I wish to kill him myself. Just take away his sword."
D'Artagnan easily hit the sword out of the guard's hand.
"Good work,"
Athos said when he saw the man's sword fly out of his hand. The guard immediately ran over to the guard whom Aramis had killed, grasped his sword, and ran back towards d'Artagnan. On his way back, he met Athos, who had again stood up and wished to continue fighting. The guard jumped at Athos, believing that he was weak and easy to defeat. With one quick movement of his arm, Athos lifted his sword and pushed it through the guard's neck. Just at that moment, Aramis hit the sword away from his enemy and pushed him down on the ground. He held his sword to the guard's throat and made him beg for mercy. Now only Porthos was still fighting. His enemy seemed to be a very skilled swordsman, perhaps as skilled as Porthos himself. Before they could finish their fight, the wounded Jussac told the guard to stop. The man quickly jumped back, broke his sword into 2 pieces over his knee so that he would not have to give it to Porthos. He then threw the pieces over the church wall and stood staring at Porthos and the other musketeers. The musketeers always respected bravery, even in their enemies. They bowed to him, then they all helped him to carry the wounded and dead guards to the church, and then began walking back to the base of the musketeers. The 4 men walked together arm in arm, and each time they saw a musketeer, they took him in also. Soon the whole street was filled with musketeers, so, in the end, their walk became a walk of victory. D'Artagnan walked between Athos and Porthos in the front of the group, and his heart almost exploded with joy. Chapter 5 Meeting the King. News in Paris traveled quickly, and soon everyone was talking about the fight between the Musketeers and the Cardinal's guards. Mr. Treville scolded Athos, Porthos, and Aramis in public, but in private he praised and congratulated them. He decided that he should hurry to the palace to tell the king of the battle before the cardinal did. When he arrived at the palace, he found the king winning at cards. He was clearly in a very good mood.
"Come over here, Captain Treville,"
the king called.
"Did you know that the cardinal has been complaining about your men again? Ha ha! These musketeers of yours should almost be put in prison." "No, sire,"
answered Treville.
"They are good and strong men, and their only desire is to serve their king. But the cardinal's guards are always causing fights with them. My men can do nothing but defend themselves." "How did the fight happen?"
the king asked, still looking at his cards.
3 of my best men, Athos, Porthos, and Aramis, had arranged to meet a young man from Gascony behind the church. Then 5 of the cardinal's guards rode up on horses. I'm sure you can guess what 5 armed men on horses planned to do there. "It is clear,"
said the king, nodding his head.
"They must have gone there to start a fight. You are right, Captain Treville. They thought that my 3 musketeers had gone there alone, and they knew that Athos was weak from a deep wound. They must have believed that they would be easy to defend. You are right again, Treville. But I hear that your musketeers were helped by a young man from Gascony." "Yes, sire. You have heard correctly. 2 healthy musketeers, 1 wounded musketeer, and 1 young man were forced to defend themselves against 5 of the cardinal's professional swordsmen, and they won. Why, this is an amazing victory,"
cried the king, his eyes bright with excitement.
"Tell me about this young man. He is the only son of one of my oldest friends. His name is D'Artagnan. He was the one who defeated Jussac and gave him the terrible wound which made the cardinal so angry." "The young man wounded Jussac? Jussac is one of the most skilled swordsmen in France. Captain Treville, that's not possible." "It is true, sire." "I would like to meet this young man from Gascony, Treville. He has shown great bravery. It seems that he could join our musketeers. What do you think?"
Treville thought for a minute, and then said,
"He comes from one of France's best families, and his courage is great. I believe that he would serve you as a musketeer to the death. Then bring him to meet me tomorrow at noon, and bring the other 3 also. I would like to reward them for their uncommon courage."
Treville smiled, bowed deeply to the king, and left to tell the musketeers of the great honor that waited for them. When D'Artagnan heard that he was going to meet the king, he became so excited that he could not eat or sleep. The next day D'Artagnan dressed in his best clothes and followed Athos, Porthos, and Aramis as they entered the king's great hall.
"Come forward, my brave men,"
said the king. He smiled softly at the 4 of them.
"I must scold you,"
he said while laughing. The musketeers walked forward, with D'Artagnan walking closely behind them.
"God in heaven,"
continued the king,
"the cardinal lost 4 of his guards in one day. If you men keep acting this way, poor Cardinal Richelieu will not have any men left in 2 weeks' time. Sire, my men have come to ask you to forgive their actions,"
said Treville, smiling.
"Looking at the happiness in their faces, I doubt that."
The king replied with a laugh.
"Treville, you told me yesterday that the man from Gascony was quite young. I can see now that he is still a boy, and yet you say that he defeated Jussac?" "It is true, my king."
The king then insisted that d'Artagnan himself tell him the story of his fight with Jussac. He listened with great pleasure. He then turned to Athos, Porthos, and Aramis.
"It seems you have had your revenge for the other day in the inn,"
he said.
"Let this revenge be the end of your fighting with the cardinal's guards, gentlemen. You should all be satisfied now." "If you are satisfied, sire,"
said Treville,
"then we are also."
The king smiled.
"I would like to show my great satisfaction,"
he said. He then turned to Athos.
"Tell me,"
he began,
"do you and your friends still plan to fight with Mr. d'Artagnan?"
Athos looked shocked.
"Of course not, my king,"
he replied.
"He has become one of us. Beginning today, we shall be known as the Four Musketeer brothers."
The king then turned to Treville.
"Well, Captain Treville,"
he said,
"it looks like you should make young d'Artagnan a musketeer."
Chapter 6. Mr. Bonacieux. The king rewarded d'Artagnan with some money before he left. On the way out of the palace, Athos, Porthos, and Aramis told him that he should hire a servant, and they found him a young man named Planchet from Picardy. Mr. Treville also had a gift for d'Artagnan, a musketeer uniform that fit him perfectly, and a new sword. The next day, d'Artagnan entered the musketeers' station and walked round with his friends, as if he had been a musketeer for months already. For the next few weeks, life was calm and happy. The four men became good friends and spent the days practicing their sword skills and the evening talking together. Then one afternoon, d'Artagnan heard a strange knock at his door. He opened the door and saw a short and fat man with a round face and round eyes.
"Mr. d'Artagnan,"
the man began,
"everyone in Paris knows that you are a young man of uncommon courage. I have come here to ask for your help." "My help?"
d'Artagnan said, feeling a little bit surprised.
"The problem is with my niece, sir. Her name is Constance, and she works in the palace for the queen. She makes clothing."
The little man's face then became quite sad.
"Yesterday morning she was attacked by some men and carried off as she was walking home." "But what kind of man would attack a young woman?"
asked d'Artagnan.
"I am not certain who did it, but I believe I know someone who might want to capture her. There is a man who works for Cardinal Richelieu. He knows that Constance is a close friend with the Queen. I think he captured her, hoping to discover the King and Queen's secrets. The Cardinal believes that the Queen is helping England and Spain against our country. He has told this to the King and has made him very nervous about his wife. The Queen has had a very hard life because of the Cardinal. Sir, how do you know all this about the affairs of the palace?"
d'Artagnan asked.
"My niece told me, sir. She has also told me that recently someone has made a plan to trap the Queen. The Queen learned that someone has written a letter using the Queen's name to the Duke of Buckingham in England, asking him to come to France. The Duke has great respect for the Queen and will certainly come quickly to Paris. When he does, he will be trapped by the Queen's enemies, and then people will believe that the Queen was going to help England against France. I still don't understand why someone would capture your niece. They know that the Queen trusts my niece and could use her to learn the Queen's secrets, or even could use her as a spy." "That may be so,"
d'Artagnan agreed.
"Who do you think captured your niece?" "I don't know his name. I only know that he is a tall and dark-skinned man with a proud face, black hair, and a large scar on one cheek." "Tall? Dark? A large scar on his cheek? I know that man. He is the man I met in Mung.
D'Artagnan yelled as he quickly jumped to his feet.
If this was the man who captured your niece, then a stab from my sword will give us both our revenge. Where can I find this man? I don't know. No ideas?
D'Artagnan cried.
Is that all you know? Yes. Oh, and this morning I received this letter.
He pulled a letter from his pocket and handed it to D'Artagnan. Only 2 sentences were written on the letter.
Do not try and find your niece. If you do, we will kill her and you also. This letter was only written to scare you.
D'Artagnan said.
I know, sir. However, I am truly scared. I am not skilled with a sword, and I could be put in prison. I understand, Mr. My name is Bonacieux.
The man said with a bow.
I own this building and live in the rooms below you. I have seen you walking around with those 3 Musketeers, who I know do not like Cardinal Richelieu. So I thought you might be willing to help our poor queen, my niece, and make trouble for the cardinal at the same time. I certainly would.
D'Artagnan said with a smile.
I thought I could offer you this bag of silver to help with your expenses.
Mr. Bonacieux said.
This is quite a large bag,
said D'Artagnan, receiving the silver happily.
You must be a very rich man, Mr. Bonacieux. Well, you could say that I am doing quite well, sir. Recently my business has...
He suddenly stopped talking and ran to the window.
Look!
He yelled, his eyes wide with surprise.
Out there in the street. It's the man with the scar.
D'Artagnan ran to the window also.
It is him,
he cried, recognizing the man of Meung.
This time he will not escape.
He grasped his sword and ran out of the door. As he jumped down the stairs, he met Athos, Porthos, and Aramis, who were coming to visit him.
Move!
D'Artagnan yelled as he ran between them.
What are you doing?
Porthos yelled as he passed.
It's the man of Mung,
D'Artagnan replied without stopping his run. D'Artagnan had told them about his fight in Meung, so they understood what he meant. They did not understand why he wanted to find this man so much, so they continued walking up the stairs. D'Artagnan got down to the street, but, again, he was too late. The man of Meung had disappeared. When D'Artagnan returned home, he found his 3 friends waiting for him. Mr. Bonacieux was gone, but D'Artagnan told the other musketeers of the little man's trouble.
A young woman has been attacked and carried off,
D'Artagnan finished saying.
This girl is now in prison, perhaps even being hurt. Only because she is loyal to the queen, I must help save her.
Suddenly, they heard the loud sounds of feet rushing up the stairs. The door was opened with a violent sound, and Mr. Bonacieux ran into the room. His eyes were wild and full of fear.
Help me,
he yelled.
4 of the cardinal's guards have come to arrest me.
The 4 guards ran into the room after him, but, seeing the 4 musketeers with swords on their belts, they stopped.
Come in, gentlemen,
D'Artagnan said in a calm voice.
We are all loyal to the king and cardinal. Then you will not stop us in our work?
The leader of the guards asked, looking calmer, knowing that he would not have to fight with the famous musketeers.
Of course not,
replied D'Artagnan. Mr. Bonacieux stared at D'Artagnan with deep anger in his eyes.
You promised that you would help me,
he whispered.
We can only help save you and your niece if we are free ourselves,
D'Artagnan whispered back.
Do not worry, I will do what I promised.
Then D'Artagnan said loudly to the guards,
I have no reason to protect this man. I met him for the first time today when he came to collect the rent. He wants too much money for this small room, and I shall be happy to see him in prison.
The 4 guards all laughed with d'Artagnan. They grasped Mr. Bonacieux and pulled him out of the room.
"Why didn't you defend him?"
Porthos cried.
"How could you let a man who has asked for our help to be arrested? Aramis, do you agree with D'Artagnan?" "Yes, I definitely do,"
Aramis replied, and Porthos looked shocked.
"Listen, friends,"
said d'Artagnan without explaining his actions to Porthos.
"All for one and one for all. This is what we always say, is it not?"
Soon after the guards had arrested Mr. Bonacieux, they moved into his rooms below d'Artagnan's. They made his rooms into a trap. Each time someone would knock on the door, the guards would open it and then close and lock it behind them. All the people who came to see Mr. Bonacieux were kept prisoner until they had told the guards everything that they knew about Bonacieux and his niece. Luckily, d'Artagnan could still come in and out since his room had a separate door and hall. For the next few days, d'Artagnan did not leave his room. He watched out of his window to see what visitors came and left. He also pulled out a piece of wood from his floor, so that he could listen to the conversations between Cardinal's guards and their prisoners below. 3 days after the guards had arrested Bonacieux, d'Artagnan heard a loud knocking at the street door. The door was quickly opened and shut again. Someone was caught. D'Artagnan ran over to his hole in the floor and listened. He could hear the sounds of people struggling. Then a woman's voice cried out, "This is my uncle's home. I am Constance Bonacieux, and I work in the palace for the Queen." D'Artagnan jumped to his feet when he heard this. He called to his servant Planchet.
"Run, quickly,"
he said.
"Go and find Athos, Porthos, and Aramis. Tell them to come here as quickly as possible. I am going to go down to Mr. Bonacieux's house below. I will be caught in the trap, but I will make the guards regret it."
A minute later, d'Artagnan knocked at the street door. The door was opened, and d'Artagnan ran in with his sword in hand into the room. One of the guards reached for his sword, but d'Artagnan stabbed him through the shoulder before he could pull it out. The 2 other soldiers jumped at d'Artagnan with chairs, but d'Artagnan wounded both of them with his sword, and all 3 guards ran out the door. D'Artagnan found Constance Bonacieux lying in a chair, breathing hard. She opened her eyes as d'Artagnan walked toward her. She was a very beautiful young woman. She had dark hair, blue eyes, and a small and perfect nose. She smiled at him. "I have seen you before around the city. You are Mr. d'Artagnan, the musketeer," she said. "You have bravely saved me. How can I thank you?" D'Artagnan bowed deeply.
"Madam,"
he said,
"I do not need any thanks."
"What has happened to my uncle?" she asked in a worried voice.
"I'm sorry to tell you that he has been put in prison,"
d'Artagnan answered. "But why? Has he done anything wrong?"
"He is your uncle, Madame Bonacieux, that is why."
"Oh, I see. You must know about—"
"Yes, I know that you were captured by a tall man with a scar on his face, but I don't know how you escaped."
"I was put in a room on the 3rd floor of a building not very far from the palace. I waited until after dark today and climbed down from the window using the sheets on my bed. I didn't know where to go, so I ran here to find my uncle."
"What can we do now?"
asked d'Artagnan.
"Those men will certainly go and get help. If they come back and find us here, we will certainly be killed. Where can I take you?"
"I don't know, Mr. d'Artagnan," Constance said sadly. "I don't know anybody who I can trust. I wanted to ask my uncle to go to the palace and find Mr. Laporte, who is a loyal helper of the Queen. I need to see him, because I must know what has happened to the Queen since I was captured. I am afraid to go and see the Queen until I am sure that it is safe. But now I have no friends to send.
You may trust me, madam,
D'Artagnan said with excitement. You are truly a brave man, and I believe that I can trust you, said Constance. Please go to the palace and ask for Mr. Germain. When he asks you what you want, you must answer, travels and stories. Then he will ask you what you want again. Tell him that you need to see Mr. Laporte. She then paused and looked worried. Where can you bring him to meet me?
I'll take you now to my friend's room, another musketeer named Athos,
said D'Artagnan.
He will be happy to hide you.
They left the house and moved quickly and quietly through the streets of Paris. Finally, they arrived at Athos' house. Just a few minutes later, D'Artagnan arrived at the palace. He told Mr. Laporte where Constance was hiding, and Laporte ran there as quickly as possible. D'Artagnan left the palace and walked along the river, thinking of Constance Bonacieux and how beautiful she was. Suddenly, he remembered that he had sent Planchet to get his friends and that he should explain to them why he did so. He turned around and began walking towards Aramis' home. Just before he arrived at the house, he saw a woman walking quickly ahead of him, wearing a long cloak. The woman stopped in front of Aramis' house and knocked on the window 3 times. A moment later, someone inside knocked 2 times. Then the woman replied by knocking 3 times again, and the window opened. D'Artagnan watched the woman take out a handkerchief from her pocket and show it to the person in the house. He then heard the sound of low voices. D'Artagnan was surprised to see that it was not Aramis inside, but a woman. After a minute, the window closed. The woman wearing the long cloak turned around and passed D'Artagnan. She was looking down to hide her face, but D'Artagnan could see that she was Constance Bonacieux. Chapter 7. The Duke of Buckingham. D'Artagnan decided to follow after Constance. After hearing the sound of his footsteps, Constance looked back and saw the dark figure of a man following after her. She screamed with fear and began to run as fast as she could. D'Artagnan ran after her and soon came close enough to grasp her arm. When he did, she screamed and fell down on her knees, crying, "Kill me! Please just kill me! I will tell you nothing!" Then she turned around and looked into D'Artagnan's eyes and cried with happiness. "It is you, dear D'Artagnan," she said. "Have you been following me?"
"No, I came here to see my friend Aramis and saw you knocking on his window."
"Who is Aramis?"
"You certainly must know him. You were just at his house,"
said D'Artagnan. "I've never even heard that name before." "This was the first time that I went to that house," said Constance.
"Didn't you go there to visit him?"
"Certainly not. Didn't you see me speaking to a woman?"
"I don't understand why she was at Aramis's house. Who is she?"
"That is a secret."
"Madame Bonacieux, you are lovely and polite, but you are also full of secrets."
"Perhaps I am," she answered with a smile. "Now, please stop asking so many questions. Instead, you can walk me where I am going."
"Where do you wish to go?"
"I will tell you as we walk. However, you must promise to take me to the door and then leave me, or I will have to ask you to leave now."
"I am a man of honor. You have my promise. Please take my arm and we will go."
They walked for a while to a narrow street where Constance seemed to recognize a small wood door and stop in front of it. "Thank you for all your help, Mr. D'Artagnan," she said. Then she added nervously, "You will not forget your promise, will you?"
"I will leave now,"
said D'Artagnan, bowing to her.
"Good night, Madame Bonacieux."
D'Artagnan knew that he was not far from the house of Athos, and he decided to go and visit him. As he walked up the stairs to Athos' room, however, he met his servant Planchet coming down. Planchet looked very worried.
"Sir, Mr. Athos was arrested by the cardinal's guards,"
said Planchet.
"They found him in your room, and they thought that he was you." "What? Didn't he tell them his name?" "No, sir. He wouldn't tell them. Before they grasped him, he whispered to me, 'D'Artagnan needs to be free now, for he knows everything about this affair. I will tell these guards who I am in 3 days, but until then they will think that they have arrested D'Artagnan.'" "Athos is truly a man of honor,"
said D'Artagnan.
"But what about Porthos and Aramis?" "I looked, but could not find them." "Did you leave letters at their houses saying that I needed to meet with them?" "Yes, I did, sir." "I see. Then I must ask you to wait here. If they come back, tell them what has happened to Athos. Tell them to meet me at the Pine Tree Inn. I'll run and tell Mr. Treville all that has happened."
Running as fast as he could, D'Artagnan arrived soon at Treville's home. Treville was not there, and his servant told D'Artagnan that he had gone to the palace. D'Artagnan decided to go there at once. Just before arriving at the castle, D'Artagnan saw in front of him a woman wearing a cloak and a man wearing the uniform of a musketeer. He knew at once that the woman was Constance, and he guessed that the man was Aramis, though he could not see clearly because the man was holding a handkerchief in front of his face. D'Artagnan immediately became full of jealousy and anger. He walked forward with quick steps, moving past the two people, and then he turned back around to meet them. The musketeer holding the handkerchief in front of his face moved back a step.
"What do you want, sir?"
he said angrily. The man spoke in a foreign accent that surprised D'Artagnan.
"You are not Aramis,"
he cried.
"No, sir, I certainly am not,"
replied the man.
"Since you do not know us, please allow us to pass." "Though I do not know you, sir, I know this lady quite well,"
D'Artagnan said. "You promised not to wait for me or follow me," Constance said in anger.
"And you, Madame Bonacieux, told me—"
D'Artagnan began, but he was interrupted by the stranger.
"Please, take my arm, madam,"
he said,
"and we will go on our way."
He pushed D'Artagnan to one side with his hand as they walked past. D'Artagnan, filled with anger, jumped back and pulled out his sword. At the same moment, and as fast as lightning, the man pulled out his. "Stop!" Constance cried, jumping between the two men. "Do not fight here, or we will all be destroyed." D'Artagnan put his sword back in his belt and asked,
"Tell me who you are, sir, and I will let you pass."
"He is the Duke of Buckingham," Constance said angrily, "and your foolish actions may possibly cause all of our deaths." Chapter 8. The Man with the Scar.
"Sir Duke, Madame Bonacieux, I am truly sorry,"
D'Artagnan said respectfully.
"But I love this woman, sir, and I became jealous when I saw her with you. Please, excuse my actions. My life is yours to command. Tell me how I may help you."
The Duke of Buckingham smiled and reached out his hand to D'Artagnan.
"I can see that you are a brave young man, and I accept your help,"
he said.
"Follow 30 steps behind us until we enter the palace, and if you see anyone watching us, kill them."
D'Artagnan followed behind them with his hand on the handle of his sword until they entered the palace. Then, still thinking about this surprising meeting, He walked quickly to the Pine Tree Inn, where he found Aramis and Porthos waiting for him. He began to tell them everything that had happened. Meanwhile, the Duke and Constance had entered the palace. Constance brought the Duke into a small room lit only by a few candles. "Please wait here, sir," she said. "Soon someone will come to see you." She then left the room. Buckingham walked over to a mirror on the wall. He thought that the musketeer's uniform looked quite good on him. He had a strong and proud face, and many people said that he was the most handsome man in England or France. He smiled at the mirror and fixed his hair. The door opened and a woman entered. Buckingham saw her in the mirror and let out a cry of joy. It was the Queen herself. As she walked forward, Buckingham fell down on one knee, grasped her hand lovingly, and kissed it. "You know that the letter you received was fake. I did not send for you," the Queen said without breath.
"Yes, madam,"
replied Buckingham.
"Constance told me, but I am still happy that I have come because now I can see you."
"By coming here," cried the Queen, "you risk your life and my honor. I have come here only to tell you that we can never see each other again."
"I know, and I will go,"
he replied.
"But do not make my trip here all a loss. Please give me something of yours to remember you by, something that you have worn, so that I may always wear it and think of you."
"Will you leave here and go back to England immediately if I give you what you ask?"
"Yes, I promise you that I will leave at once."
"Wait here, then. I will return." The Queen left the room for a minute and came back holding a wood box. She handed it to Buckingham. "Take this," she said softly, "and keep it to remember me." Buckingham fell to his knees and took the box. "Do not forget your promise," the Queen said, with great worry in her voice.
"I shall keep my word. Your hand, madam, and I leave."
The Queen held out her hand and closed her eyes. Buckingham kissed her hand softly and stood up.
"I will see you again, madam, even if I have to fight and change the whole world,"
he said, and left the room. Constance was waiting in the hall and led him away from the palace. Mr. Bonacieux sat locked in prison for 2 days and 3 nights. On the morning of the 3rd day, 2 guards entered his room, followed by an officer.
"Follow me,"
the guard said coldly, and the scared little man followed. The guards opened an old wood door and threw him into a small room. An officer was sitting in front of a small table. The room was quite dark. The officer raised his head and looked up.
"Sit down, Mr. Bonacieux,"
he ordered in a strong voice.
"You are here because of planning against our king." "Sir,"
Bonacieux cried, with tears in his eyes.
"It is not true." "Is it not?"
the officer said angrily.
"I suggest that you quickly tell me the truth. The cardinal is very angry, and you do not want to make him angrier."
Bonacieux's face turned as white as snow.
"I will tell you everything I know,"
he cried.
"Please ask me anything, I beg you." "Very well. First, tell me, where is your niece?" "I don't know, sir, truly. Many days ago she was captured and taken away." "Yes, she was. But yesterday, because of you, she escaped." "Escaped? Sir, I promise, if she has escaped, it is not because of me." "If it is not because of you, then why did you visit the musketeer named D'Artagnan?" "I asked him to help me find my niece. I did not know that she had been arrested. I thought she was captured by thieves, and that I had a duty to find her. If I was wrong, I beg for your mercy." "I will tell you, Mr. Bonacieux. Mr. D'Artagnan attacked the officers who had arrested your niece. He now has hidden her somewhere. Luckily, we have recently found D'Artagnan and arrested him."
The officer yelled to the guard,
"Bring in D'Artagnan!"
A few minutes later, the guards pulled in Athos. Mr. Bonacieux stared at him with shocked eyes.
"This is not Mr. D'Artagnan,"
he yelled out.
"This man does not look anything like him."
The officer looked at Athos.
"Your name?"
he asked seriously.
"Athos. But before you said it was D'Artagnan,"
he said angrily.
"I certainly did not. An officer said to me, 'You are Mr. D'Artagnan.' And I answered, 'You think so?' Then your guards said that they were sure that I was D'Artagnan, so I could not argue." "You are free to leave then, mister,"
said the policeman. As Athos walked from the room, the officer turned toward the guards and said angrily,
"Take Mr. Bonacieux back to his room and find the real D'Artagnan."
The guards locked Bonacieux in his prison room again. He waited there until about 9 in the evening, when he heard steps in his hall. The door opened and the guards came in again.
"Follow me,"
said an officer, who came in after the guards. Bonacieux was led to a carriage and was driven for almost an hour through the streets of Paris until the carriage stopped before a large door. 2 guards took Bonacieux, now completely pale with fear, up some stairs and into a room filled with maps and books. There was a fire in the room, and a man stood in front of it. He was of middle height and had a thin face with a gray beard and mustache and very powerful eyes.
"Is this Mr. Bonacieux?"
he asked.
"Yes, sir,"
replied the officer at Bonacieux's side.
"Very good. You may leave us now."
The officer and guards left.
"Mr. Bonacieux, you have planned against our king with your niece and the Duke of Buckingham." "Sir, I promise you that I do not know anything about it,"
cried Bonacieux.
"My niece has spoken of the Duke before, but what did she say about him?"
interrupted the man.
"She told me that Cardinal Richelieu had tricked the Duke of Buckingham into coming to France, so that he could destroy him and the Queen. Do you know who captured your niece?" "No, sir, but I have some ideas." "Did you know that your niece has escaped?" "Yes, sir. An officer told me while I was in prison."
The man stood there silent for a moment. He then hit a silver bell and the officer entered.
"Tell Mr. Rochefort to come here immediately,"
the man said.
"Yes, Cardinal,"
the policeman said while bowing.
"Cardinal?"
Bonacieux thought with a sad heart.
"Now I am in big trouble."
A moment later the door opened and a tall, dark man with a large scar on his cheek came in.
"That's him!"
Bonacieux cried excitedly.
"That man carried away my niece."
The cardinal hit his bell again. The officer came back in.
"Take Mr. Bonacieux back outside,"
said Richelieu.
"and let him wait until I send for him."
Bonacieux was led out of the room. The tall, dark stranger stepped closer to the cardinal and said excitedly,
"They have seen each other." "Who?" "The Duke of Buckingham has been to see the Queen." "Where did they meet?" "At the palace." "How do you know?" "Our good friend Madame Lannoy told me." "Why didn't she let me know sooner?" "The Queen has kept her busy in the palace all the time." "Tell me everything that happened." "Madame Lannoy says that late at night, at about 12, the Queen was in her bedroom, and one of her servants brought her a handkerchief from Madame Bonacieux. The Queen became very pale and said excitedly, 'Wait here for me, ladies. I will return soon.' She was gone about 15 minutes, and then she returned, picked up a small wooden box from the room, and left again. When she came back again, she did not have the box with her." Does Madame Lannoy know what was in the box?
Asked Richelieu.
Yes. Inside was a sash covered with 12 diamonds, which the king gave to the queen on her birthday,
replied Rochefort.
And the queen gave the earrings to Buckingham? Madame Lannoy is sure she must have.
Richelieu thought about this for a moment and then hit his bell a third time. He instructed the officer to bring Bonacieux back in. Rochefort left the room.
You have lied to me,
the cardinal said seriously.
No, sir,
cried Bonacieux, looking shocked.
I have told you everything I know. Your niece escaped and went to meet the Duke of Buckingham. Oh, yes, certainly the great cardinal is right,
Bonacieux cried.
But I was too stupid to know the truth. You are truly the great cardinal, who knows everything that happens in France.
The cardinal's lips smiled a strange smile. He stood up and reached out his hand calmly to Bonacieux.
I was wrong about you, my friend Bonacieux,
he said simply.
I see now that you are a good man. It is an honor to touch the hand of such a great man,
cried Bonacieux.
The great man has even called me his friend. Yes, you are my friend indeed,
the cardinal said.
And since you were hurt and arrested wrongly, I would be happy if you will accept this bag of gold. Great cardinal, I will leave here very honored. Goodbye, then, Mr. Bonacieux. I hope that we will meet again. I am your willing servant, Cardinal. Goodbye for now, Mr. Bonacieux.
Bonacieux bowed deeply and walked out backwards, facing Richelieu and yelling,
Long life to the Cardinal!
A half an hour passed, and then Rochefort returned.
We are too late,
he said.
The Duke of Buckingham has already left France. He must have returned to London. He must be found,
said the cardinal.
Send this letter to England at once.
He sat down and quickly wrote a note.
Milady, go to the next party that the Duke of Buckingham attends. He will wear a sash with 12 diamonds. Get close to the Duke and cut 2 of the diamonds off his sash. Write to me as soon as you have gotten these diamonds.
Chapter 9. Making the Trap. A week later, the cardinal received a letter. I have the diamonds, but I do not have enough money to leave London. Send me 500 gold pieces. Once I receive the money, I shall immediately come to Paris. My Lady. The cardinal sent my lady the money and then went at once to see the king. He talked for a while about some money affairs and then, a little carefully, said,
My king, perhaps the queen would be pleased if you had a party in her honor. You know how much she enjoys dancing. A dancing party?
Said the king, quite surprised at the cardinal's suggestion.
But I hate dancing. Then, my king, I believe the queen will be even more pleased if you arrange one especially for her. A party will give her an opportunity to wear that beautiful diamond sash which you gave her for her birthday. Perhaps it is a good idea,
said the king.
When should we have this party?
The cardinal thought silently for a moment and said,
The 3rd of October, I think, my king, would be an excellent day. Very well,
said the king.
I will go and see the queen at once.
The queen was sitting alone in her room, and the king told her about the plan for the party. What a wonderful idea, my king, she began. I do truly love dancing.
During the evening of this party,
he said,
I wish you to wear the diamond sash I gave you on your birthday.
The queen became pale and looked at her husband with great fear in her eyes. The king saw this but did not understand why. "When is the party?" asked the Queen.
"Soon, my love. I will ask Cardinal Richelieu."
"Oh, it was the Cardinal, then, who wanted me to wear my diamond sash to the party?"
"Yes, the Cardinal had suggested it."
The King then left the room. She fell onto her bed, put her head down on her pillow, and began to cry. What was she going to do? "May I help you, my Queen?" said a soft voice. The Queen turned around and saw Constance Bonacieux standing behind her, who had heard everything that the King had said. "Do not be afraid, madam," Constance said. "I think I can help you in your trouble." "Tell me truly," said the Queen, reaching out her hand. "Can I trust you to help me?" "Yes, madam," the young woman said as she fell down to her knees. "I am prepared to die for my Queen. We must get back the diamond sash. My Queen gave it to the Duke of Buckingham, did you not? We must send someone to see the Duke. I will find someone to go. Write a letter to the Duke, and I promise that it will be delivered. I will give your letter to my uncle. He often travels on business, and no one would think that he would be carrying a letter of his Queen. In fact, I can put the letter in his things, and he will not even know that he is carrying it." "I will trust you to help me, then," said the Queen. She ran over to a little table on which there were pens and paper. She wrote a note quickly and then closed the letter. "You will need money for this trip also," she said, pulling at a ring on her finger. "Take this ring. I believe it is worth a lot of money. Sell it and have your uncle go immediately. I will have it done within an hour." Constance left the palace and within 10 minutes was at her uncle's house. "Uncle, I need your help," Constance said.
"Did you know,"
he cried,
"that I have just spent 2 days and nights in prison?"
"Yes, uncle. A short time like that passes quickly," she said without caring. "I need you to do something important for me. Do not worry, you will be paid well for it." Bonacieux's eyes became bright with excitement.
"How much?"
he asked. "I don't know exactly. 1,000 gold pieces, perhaps. Now, listen to me carefully, uncle. This is what you must do. You must leave Paris at once. I will give you an important paper that you must not lose, and which you will deliver to a man."
"Where do I need to go?"
"London."
"London? You are joking with me. I have no business in London."
"But now you do have business there. The person who wants you to go is a very famous person."
"I see,"
cried Bonacieux.
"More of your crazy plans. The Cardinal has told me about all your wild ideas and troublemaking."
"The Cardinal?" Constance said in shock, staring hard at her uncle. "Have you gone to see the Cardinal?"
"Yes, he sent for me,"
replied her uncle proudly.
"He called me his friend."
"Are you working for the Cardinal now?" whispered Constance.
"Yes, and I am very well paid for it,"
replied Bonacieux, pulling out the bag of gold that the Cardinal gave him and showing it to his niece. Constance became very worried about having told her uncle so much, so she tried to hide her thoughts. "Perhaps you are right, uncle," she said. "It is better to work for the great Cardinal than for the Queen. Forget my crazy idea."
"Aren't you going to tell me what I need to do in London?"
replied her uncle, wanting to hear some interesting news. "Oh, it was really nothing important," said Constance. "It was just about buying some things that only interest women." The more Constance tried to stop talking, the more important her uncle thought her secret was. He decided to go quickly to tell the Cardinal that the Queen was looking for somebody to take a letter to London. He said goodbye to Constance and ran off as fast as his small legs would move him. "What shall I do now?" cried Constance. A moment later, as there came a knock on the ceiling and Constance jumped up in fear. "Who is that?" she yelled up. A voice came through the ceiling. It said,
"Madame Bonacieux, please open the door in the street for me and I will come down and see you."
Constance thought about the voice for a moment, and a look of hope came to her eyes. It was the voice of d'Artagnan.